He raised his glass, smiling like a king. "To my ex-wife," Ethan said, eyes cold. "Proof that some people settle for a pathetic life." Laughter rippled through the room. All eyes turned to Clara. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, just set her champagne down with quiet precision. Moments later, the doors opened. A man in a tailored suit stepped in, voice cutting through the room. "We'd like to thank Ms. Whitmore, the sole investor who just acquired this entire company." Silence crashed. Ethan's smile broke. Clara met his eyes and simply walked away. He had no idea who she had become. He thought silence meant weakness. He had no idea it was restraint. The chandelier light spilled across the ballroom like liquid gold, catching the edges of crystal glasses and polished marble, and somewhere between the low hum of laughter and the soft clink of champagne, Ethan Cole stood at the center of it all, confident, composed, untouchable, his arm loosely draped around the waist of a woman who looked like she had stepped straight out of a magazine, her smile bright, her presence loud. Everything Clara Whitmore used to be told she wasn't, and yet there she stood, just a few feet away, in a simple navy dress that didn't beg for attention, didn't sparkle, didn't compete, but somehow held the room in a quiet gravity that no one could quite explain, her fingers wrapped around a glass she hadn't tasted, her posture still, her breathing slow, like she had already lived this moment before and knew exactly how it would unfold. And when Ethan's voice cut through the room, smooth and deliberate, people turned instinctively, because Ethan always knew how to command attention, always knew how to perform. "I just want to say," he began, lifting his glass slightly, the corner of his mouth curling into something that looked like a smile but felt like a blade, "that success isn't for everyone." A few polite chuckles rippled, uncertain at first, then growing as his eyes landed directly on Clara, sharp, intentional. "Some people settle," he added, pausing just long enough for the silence to stretch, for the implication to settle into the bones of everyone watching, for a small life, a pathetic one. And this time the laughter came easier, softer in tone but heavier in meaning, the kind that didn't echo loudly but lingered uncomfortably in the air, and all eyes shifted to her, waiting, expecting something, anger, tears, anything. But Clara didn't move, didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch, only a slow, almost imperceptible inhale as she set her glass down on the passing tray with careful precision. The faintest click against the metal sounding louder than his entire speech, and in that moment, there was something unsettling about her stillness, something that didn't match the narrative they had all accepted so easily. Because this wasn't the woman they remembered, not the one who used to stand beside Ethan like a reflection, not the one who smiled on command and dimmed herself to let him shine. This version of Clara was quieter, yes, but there was weight in that silence, something grounded, something deliberate, like the calm before a shift no one saw coming. And as Ethan basked in the attention, mistaking her composure for defeat, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened just enough to let in a draft of cool night air, subtle, almost unnoticed, but enough to make a few heads turn, enough to stir the edges of something about to change, and Clara, without looking back, simply reached for her clutch, her expression unreadable, as if the moment that was meant to break her had already passed, and whatever came next was never going to belong to him. She walked out of the ballroom as if nothing had happened, but the sound of his voice still echoed somewhere behind her, not loud, not sharp, just persistent, like a memory that refused to fade. And for a moment, as the cool night air brushed against her skin, Clara closed her eyes, not in pain, but in recognition, because she had heard those words before, not in a ballroom filled with strangers, but in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, where no one could see how slowly a person could be diminished, how gently someone could be convinced they were not enough. And years ago, she would have believed him. She would have stood there with a forced smile, absorbing every word like it was truth, shrinking just enough to make him comfortable. But that version of her had not survived. Not the night she found the emails he never meant for her to see. Not the morning she realized that everything she had built had been quietly transferred, rewritten, erased, and certainly not the day she stood in a lawyer's office, listening as her life was reduced to numbers on a page, assets divided, value assigned, her contributions minimized into something almost invisible, And yet even then, she had said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already understood something he never would. That power did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived in silence, in patience, in the long quiet stretch of time where no one was watching, where rebuilding did not look impressive, where success did not announce itself. And as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in the glass windows around her, there was no trace of the woman he had described, no sign of anything pathetic, only someone who had learned how to exist without needing to be seen. And behind her, inside that glowing room, the version of Clara they all believed in still lingered, frozen in their assumptions, but outside, in the quiet, she had already moved beyond them, already stepped into something they had not yet realized. Because while Ethan had been busy performing success, she had been constructing something far less visible and far more permanent. Late nights that no one applauded, meetings that carried no headlines, decisions made without audience or validation, and piece by piece, without announcement, without spectacle, she had built a life that did not rely on anyone else's approval, a life that did not need to prove itself in rooms like that. And somewhere back inside, laughter rose again, softer now, uncertain, as if the room itself had begun to sense the shift it could not yet explain, because something had changed the moment she chose not to respond, something subtle but irreversible. And as a black car pulled quietly to the curb, its engine barely audible over the distant city noise, Clara did not hesitate, did not look back. She simply opened the door and stepped inside, her reflection briefly catching in the tinted glass, calm, composed, unreadable. And as the car pulled away, leaving the glow of the ballroom behind, one truth lingered quietly in the air, unseen but undeniable. She had never been the one who lost everything. She had simply been the one who stopped letting him see what she was becoming. The car moved through the city without a sound, the world outside reduced to streaks of light and shadow. And for a while Clara said nothing, not to the driver, not to herself, just watching as familiar streets passed like fragments of a life she no longer belonged to, until the car slowed, turning into a quiet entrance beneath a building that did not announce itself with noise or excess, just clean lines, polished stone, and a kind of understated authority that did not need validation. And when the door opened for her, the air inside felt different, cooler, controlled, intentional, like every detail had been designed by someone who understood power did not need to be loud. And as she stepped into the private elevator, the doors closing softly behind her, the silence wrapped around her again. But this time it was not heavy. It was hers, earned, chosen. And as the numbers climbed steadily upward, her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls, not searching, not uncertain, just present. And somewhere across the city, in that glowing ballroom, the energy had begun to shift in a way Ethan could not quite understand, because moments after she left, conversations had changed tone, subtle at first, a question here, a glance there, until one of the senior partners, a man who rarely attended these events without purpose, had stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks with quiet precision, his voice cutting cleanly through the room, asking a question that seemed simple but landed with unexpected weight, asking who had finalized the acquisition documents that had just come through, asking who had signed off on the controlling shares that had quietly changed hands within the last hour. And Ethan, still holding on to the confidence of a moment that was already slipping away, had answered without thinking, dismissively, as if it was just another detail beneath him. But the man's expression did not shift, did not mirror that dismissal. Instead it settled into something more measured, something closer to curiosity edged with realization. And then came the name, spoken not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it moved through the room like a ripple that could not be contained, Clara Whitmore. And for a second it did not register, not fully, because the image in his mind did not align with the reality being presented, because the woman he had just mocked, the one who stood in silence while he defined her, was now being referenced in a context that did not fit the narrative he had built so carefully, and laughter did not follow this time. Only stillness, the kind that stretches just long enough for truth to take hold. And as questions began to form, as eyes shifted not toward the stage but toward the empty space where she had been standing, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his composure, not fear, Not yet. But the first fracture of certainty, the first realization that there were pieces of her story he had never seen, never bothered to understand. And miles away, high above the city, Clara stepped out of the elevator into a space that belonged entirely to her, where the lights adjusted automatically, where the silence held no judgment. And as she set her clutch down on the marble counter, her phone lit up with a single notification, a confirmation, clean and simple, the transfer complete. The control secured, and she glanced at it only briefly before setting it aside, because the moment did not need celebration, it did not need acknowledgement. It simply existed, quiet and absolute. Just like her, and somewhere in the distance, the city continued as it always did, unaware that in one single night, without a single raised voice, everything had already changed. By the time the last guests left the ballroom, the laughter had already faded into something quieter, something uncertain, and Ethan could feel it in the way conversations no longer reached him the same way. In the way people who had once leaned and now kept a subtle distance, their smiles more measured, their words carefully chosen, as if something invisible had shifted and no one wanted to be the last to notice. And he told himself it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, just a delayed reaction to information that had not yet settled, because in his world, things always made sense eventually, always returned to his control. But this felt different, slower, heavier, like a realization that refused to be rushed. And when he finally stepped away from the thinning crowd, pulling his phone from his pocket with a confidence that had begun to feel forced, he saw it, the email marked urgent. The confirmation he had dismissed earlier now laid out in language that left no room for interpretation, controlling interest transferred, majority ownership reassigned, effective immediately, and beneath it, the name again, Clara Whitmore, not as a footnote, not as a past connection, but as the authority, the decision-maker, the one whose signature now outweighed his own. And for a moment, the room seemed to tilt, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but just enough for him to understand that something fundamental had changed, something he could not simply talk his way out of. And across the city, Clara stood by the wide glass windows of her penthouse, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, lights flickering like distant signals in a world that no longer defined her. And in her hand, the same phone that had just delivered the confirmation, the same quiet notification that marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. And she did not smile, did not celebrate, because this was never about proving anything to anyone, not even to him. It was about reclaiming something that had always been hers, something that had been overlooked, underestimated, quietly taken and just as quietly rebuilt. And she could almost hear his voice in the distance, not the one from tonight, but the older one, the one that used to shape her decisions, used to define her limits, telling her what she was not capable of, what she would never become. And the memory did not hurt anymore. It simply existed, like a chapter she had already finished reading. And back in the ballroom, Ethan looked around as if expecting her to still be there, as if the presence he had just dismissed could somehow be summoned back into something manageable, something familiar. But the space where she had stood remained empty, and for the first time, it was not her absence that unsettled him. It was the realization that he had never truly seen her at all, never understood the quiet way she observed, the patience with which she waited, the strength that did not need to announce itself. And now, as the weight of that truth settled in, heavier with every passing second, there was nothing left for him to respond to, no argument to dismantle, no words to overpower, because she had already stepped beyond the reach of everything he had once used to define her. And somewhere high above the city, Clara turned away from the window, the lights reflecting briefly in her eyes before fading into something calm, something steady, as she walked deeper into the space that belonged entirely to her, leaving behind not just the room he stood in, but the version of herself he thought he knew. And in that quiet, irreversible distance, the truth settled with absolute clarity. She had never needed to say anything at all. The city did not pause for revelations, it never did. And by morning the glass towers reflected the same pale sunlight, the same quiet ambition moving through streets that had no memory of the night before. But inside Ethan's office, everything felt slightly off, not broken, not chaotic, just subtly misaligned, like a structure that still stood but no longer belonged to him in the same way, and as he stepped in, the familiar scent of polished wood and expensive cologne did nothing to restore the certainty he had always relied on, because now every detail seemed to carry a question he could not immediately answer, and the assistant who once greeted him with effortless confidence hesitated for half a second too long before speaking, her tone still professional, but edged with something new, something cautious, as she informed him that there had been updates overnight, meetings rescheduled, decisions pending review, and for the first time, approval no longer rested solely with him, and he nodded as if this was temporary, as if control could be reclaimed with the right conversation, the right call, the right assertion of authority, but the documents waiting on his desk told a different story, clean, precise, final, and once again, her name appeared where his had always been expected, Clara Whitmore, not as a shadow of his past, but as the present reality he could not override, and miles above the city. Clara moved through her morning with the same quiet rhythm she had built. Over the years, the soft hum of the espresso machine, the steady light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, the absence of noise not as emptiness but as clarity, and there was no urgency in her actions, no need to rush toward what had already been secured, because the work that mattered had been done long before this morning arrived, in the days when no one was watching, when progress did not announce itself. And as she reviewed a series of reports laid out before her, each page reflecting decisions that had once been out of her reach, there was no sense of triumph, only alignment, as if everything had finally settled into its proper place. And somewhere between the quiet of her space and the tension of his, the contrast became undeniable, because while Ethan was trying to understand how control had slipped from his grasp, Clara had already moved beyond the need to hold on to anything at all. And when his phone lit up with a notification requesting his presence at an executive meeting, mandatory, scheduled by the new majority stakeholder, the words felt unfamiliar in a way he could not ignore, not because they were unclear, but because they no longer positioned him at the center, and for a moment he stared at the screen, the weight of it settling slowly, deliberately, as if giving him time to realize what had already happened, and across the city, Clara closed the final report. Her reflection faint in the glass surface of the table, calm, steady, untouched by the noise that would inevitably follow, and, as she reached for her coat, preparing to step into a day that would now unfold on her terms, there was no need to revisit the past, no need to correct what had been said or done, because the answer had already been given, not in words, but in the quiet, irreversible shift of power, and somewhere in that distance between who she had been and who she had become, one truth remained unchanged. She had never needed to prove anything. She had only needed to become it. The conference room was colder than the rest of the building, not in temperature but in atmosphere, a space designed for decisions that did not require comfort. And as Ethan stepped inside, the familiar layout felt unfamiliar in a way he could not immediately place. The long glass table reflecting a version of himself that no longer matched the room, and for the first time, the seat at the head of the table was not waiting for him, not reserved, not implied, just another chair among many, and the executives who once turned toward him instinctively were already seated, their attention directed elsewhere, their conversations quieter, more deliberate, as if recalibrated around a new center that had not yet fully revealed itself. And he took a seat anyway, controlled, composed, holding on to the last fragments of a position that had always felt permanent, until the door opened, not dramatically, not with announcement, just a quiet shift of space as Clara walked in, and for a second, no one spoke, not because they were surprised, but because the moment required recognition, the kind that settled slowly, completely, and she did not look different, not in any obvious way, the same measured posture, the same calm presence. But there was something else now, something undeniable in the way the room adjusted around her, in the way silence followed rather than preceded her, and without hesitation, she moved to the head of the table, not claiming it, not performing authority, simply taking the seat as if it had always been hers. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, unhurried, carrying none of the sharpness he had used the night before. "Thank you all for being here," she said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they held weight in a way his never had, Because they did not seek attention, they assumed it, and Ethan watched, the distance between what he thought he knew and what stood in front of him widening with every second. As she reviewed the agenda, outlined decisions already in motion, spoke of strategy with a clarity that left no room for interruption, and no one challenged her, not because they were intimidated, but because there was nothing uncertain to question. And when her eyes finally met his, it was not with triumph, not with resentment, just recognition, brief and unspoken, as if acknowledging a chapter that no longer needed to be revisited. And he felt it then, fully, not the loss of control, but the realization that control had never belonged to him in the way he believed, that the foundation he had stood on had been supported by things he never valued, never saw. And now, as she moved through the meeting with quiet precision, every decision landing exactly where it needed to, there was no space left for the version of the story he had told himself, no place for the assumptions that had once felt so certain. And across the glass table, his reflection sat still, composed, but for the first time, it did not match the room, did not command it, did not define it. And when the meeting ended, not with applause, not with spectacle, just with a calm conclusion that left no loose ends, Clara gathered her notes, stood, and walked toward the door without looking back, without needing to confirm what had already been established. And as the executives followed her lead, their movements aligned with hers rather than his, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, the silence settling differently now, not empty, not oppressive, just final. And in that quiet, the truth became unavoidable. She had not returned to take anything from him. She had simply stepped into what had always been waiting for her, and he had been the only one who never saw it. He did not follow her immediately, not because he chose not to, but because something in him needed a moment to catch up to what had already happened. And as the conference room emptied, the quiet left behind felt different than before, not filled with anticipation or control, but with clarity, the kind that stripped away every illusion he had carefully maintained. And when he finally stood, the chair sliding back with a soft, hollow sound, it echoed more than it should have, as if the room itself was marking the shift he could no longer deny. And stepping out into the corridor, he saw it in the smallest details first, the way conversations paused when she passed, not out of fear, but respect, the way people adjusted their posture, their tone, their attention, aligning themselves not with force, but with certainty. And Clara moved through it all without hesitation, without acknowledgement of the shift, as if this had always been the natural order of things. And for a moment, Ethan watched from a distance, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he thought he had left behind, the one he believed he understood completely. But the two no longer overlapped, not even slightly. And when he finally stepped forward, calling her name, it felt unfamiliar in his own voice, stripped of the confidence that once defined it. "Clara," he said, and she paused, not immediately, not sharply, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, before turning slowly, her expression calm, composed, untouched by anything that had happened between them. And in that brief silence, he realized he had nothing prepared, no rehearsed line, no carefully chosen words to regain footing, only the weight of everything he had not seen, and everything she no longer needed from him. "I think we should talk," he added, the sentence landing flat, smaller than he intended. And for a second, she simply looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of distant clarity that made the moment feel almost irrelevant. "We already did," she replied, her voice steady, quiet, carrying none of the tension he expected. And it took him a moment to understand what she meant, because the conversation she was referring to had not been spoken, had not been argued or explained. It had unfolded in silence, in decisions made long before he realized they existed. And as he searched her face for something familiar, some trace of the past he could still reach, he found nothing that belonged to him anymore. And the realization settled slowly, heavier than any accusation, that whatever they had shared, whatever version of her he had defined, it no longer had any place in who she had become. And she did not wait for a response, did not linger for acknowledgement. She simply turned and continued walking, her steps measured, unhurried, as if the outcome had never been in question. And Ethan remained where he stood, the movement of the office continuing around him, unchanged yet completely different, because for the first time, he was not at the center of it, not the one shaping its direction, but someone observing a structure that had already shifted beyond his reach. And in that stillness, one thought surfaced, clear and unavoidable. It was never that she had nothing to say, it was that she had already said everything that mattered without a single word.